It's always a great pleasure for African Ascent to introduce you to an array of thinkers, professors, producers, psychologists, artists of various stripes. Tonight, African Ascent takes a special pleasure in bringing Dr. Stephen Foster from Berklee College of Music, which was just named the #1 college for the study of contemporary music. And tonight's guest then is part and parcel of that legacy of greatness that Berklee College of Music continues to establish. Dr. Stephen Foster is not new to African Ascent. I have had him once and impressed by the range of topics and themes that he covers, both as a very successful professor of cognitive psychology, existential psychology, and many other facets of that domain, and also an equally rigorous, successful clinical psychologist who continues to have a very attractive office, visitors report. I myself have not been there yet. If at the rate in which I'm working, I am sure I'll be a suitable candidate for psychological analysis very, very soon. So tonight then, I have decided to invite him again, and this time we're going to talk about what he dubs critical thinking or critical discourse. Critical discourse or critical thinking has had a very long and meandering history. It, unlike various philosophies such as idealism, realism, behaviorism, and existentialism, does not as yet constitute a field of study. Rather, it is a kind of thinking that is perennially applicable precisely to what idealists, realists, existentialists, and behaviorists themselves do. So we're going to take our time and very studiously and very carefully introduce my huge audience, thousands of you, that I look forward to interact with every other week as the professor enlightens us and introduces us to critical thinking. Welcome to African Ascent.
Thank you very much.
So what I thought, Stephen, is why don't we start by talking about critical thinking. What is it exactly? What does it cover? What does it not cover? What is it precisely?
Sure. Critical thinking is a term we use for a number of different theories that we have, approaches. They're all dedicated to the idea that we can think more carefully about things and that we can clarify for ourselves with more success what is actually true, what is actually useful, and we can tease out the mistaken ideas that we have. It's a fairly rigorous, especially at first, way of thinking where you try to cover all the bases and ask the right questions. But the outcome, whatever field of study you use it in, the outcome is always about trying to understand something better, more to understand something in a more useful way so that we can use it more effectively. And that's what it's for.
I'm sure you know this. As I was preparing for this interview, I had to revisit my notes on Aristotle. And Aristotle famously defined the human being as a thinking being. In fact, there are those who think that Aristotle was somehow not very kind to animals whom he thought were non-thinking, whereas he was quite kind to his own kind, namely to human beings, whom he defines as thinkers. In fact, in his structural and functional analysis of human behavior, he says something to the effect that the function of birds is to swim. The function of birds is to fly. The function of birds is to fly. The function of fish is to swim. And the function of human beings is to think. But then correct me if I'm wrong. Perhaps I'm being somewhat critical and unnecessarily harsh towards my own kind. I don't think Aristotle is right, as a matter of fact. Although I'm not a great animal lover, I don't even like pets, I'm very afraid of them. But when I look at them from a distance, I wouldn't exactly say that they think. But I do think that they do through their instincts, the equivalent of what human beings do through their so-called minds. In what way are we different from human beings? What is your psychological take on that?
My wife and I have 4 cats now. I think last time we talked we had 3. So
yes, so now...
the world gets bigger.
Yes.
And when I engage our cats, there is no doubt in my mind, in the middle of my engaging them, that they are sentient creatures, that they have a consciousness, that they have preferences about what they like and what they don't like. Our cats are Tonkinese, so they're particularly mischievous, and they like to play. I think that they have feelings, because if we go away for a few days, when we come back, they let us know that they're not all that thrilled with us. They find ways to be standoffish or knock over something valuable. So there are many ways, not just our Tonkinese, but horses, dogs. I'm in no expert place to determine who gets to think and who gets to be recognized as thinkers and who doesn't. I do recognize a quality of being that all animals have. If we're alive, we are of this shared world, we inhabit it together, and we bump into each other one way or another, and we either like bumping into each other or we don't. And we have our way of regarding each other. And I can't speak for how horses regard us or cats regard us. I think it matters a great deal for us human beings in our thinking to be self-aware enough to ask ourselves, so how am I regarding the person I'm having a conversation with? How am I regarding the conversation itself, or the topic, or the people I'll be bumping into, hopefully not physically as I drive home? Just how am I regarding them? How do I think of them? Do I think of them at all? And these are kinds of questions I don't know any other animal can ask.
I see.
But the animal called human being can ask these kinds of questions.
Which is a segue, as it were, to discuss critical thinking then. Of course, Aristotle was sufficiently modest to have only simply stated that the function of human beings is to think, very much like the function of birds is to fly, and the function of fish is to swim. But he forgot to add, perhaps deliberately, that it's not just thinking, any thinking you'd contend. It's a particular kind of thinking, which you're dubbing critical thinking. Why don't we take some time and distinguish thinking in general from critical thinking? What are the similarities and what are the differences? Where do they part company?
Sure. I want to return to the thing about the animals and human beings and have that as a foundation that I can answer your question on. The way I understand it is all of us creatures live in a world that makes sense to us. So I don't follow Aristotle's idea about we're all here to think. Clifford Geertz, Geertz, is an anthropologist who studies all sorts of things and having to do with cultures. And he defined human beings as meaning makers. That we are always about the business of trying to make sense of things, trying to understand the present moment in a way that means something to me, in a way that fits my already established ideas, in a way where I can learn something new if that's something I'm interested in doing. And I think that there's a way we share some of that with fish and horses and dogs, that we all live in a world that makes sense to us in a way. That, the dog sees what a dog is inclined to see and cares about what dogs care about, and so forth and so on. And I think we're like that we see what we're inclined to see, and we care about what we care about, and it takes some doing to get us to get outside our ordinary, already established way of thinking about things, our ordinary, already established way of caring about this and not caring about that. It takes some doing. For most of us. And one of the ways that we human beings make sense of a world is we use thinking. We think in terms of language. We use language to define terms. You are a man, I am a man, this is the color pink. Is it white, pink? No, I can't even tell. But there's, we can name things. It helps us to distinguish the objects in reality. And we then name abstract things like Democratic Party or God, and we have an idea, we have concepts, we have ideas about what things are in our world. If we're lucky, you and I will share a definition about what a man is. So when I call you a man, you don't take offense. And sometimes, and in fact very often, we might share some of the definition, but then there are ways I will define what a man is differently than you will define what a man is. We use our thinking to try to distinguish what is real. It's a primary way we determine what is real, what is not real. What is going on here? What is the meaning of this? And then, what do I want? And how do I get it? Problem solving and designing plans for a future. All of this involves a kind of thinking,
Correct me if I'm wrong again, but critical theorists quite consciously admit that they are heavily influenced by cognitive psychology on the one hand, philosophy in its various forms on the other hand, and quite disturbing in my sense, by behaviorism. How so?
Could you just say more about disturbing quality of behaviorism?
Because I tend to think that behaviorism is quite manipulative. It robs human beings of what Aristotle is contending, their capacity to think for themselves, by taking great pride in making human beings think exactly the way the cognitive psychologist would like them to think. I'm more distinctly thinking about Skinner's role and his argument against Chomsky. When Chomsky was contending, there are these linguistic vocabularies that seem to be inherent in the human mind, by which and through which we learn how to speak, which Skinner challenged by essentially saying that there are no such schemas in the human mind. All that there is behavior, and behavior is nothing more than a manipulatable consequence of what he called sanctions, contingent sanctions that a child who learns, my own son now, for example, is in the process of developing a language. He yet has to call me daddy, for example. But if he did contra Skinner, I'm not going to make sure that he calls me daddy again by giving him a hug and kissing him and rewarding him for calling me daddy the first time. Mm-hmm. I'm simply going to treat him as an autonomous being who may decide to call me daddy again only because he's linguistically equipped to do so.
To do so. So you won't consciously intend to reward him like one would reward a dog once he finally rolls over and you rub his belly and give him a treat and call him good boy. Yeah, that approach, the behaviorist approach, is called conditioning, mm-hmm. or it's just a broad term, which is a kind of manipulating. Mm-hmm. And it was the last group of theories that I was willing to study in graduate school because I had a profound distaste for it. I had a prejudged idea that I did not like the idea that we were robots and we could just be manipulated and all that. I finally came to study it and came to see how useful it was when it is useful. I think it describes something that really is real, that us human beings, whatever else is true about us and our mind and what is possible for a range of thinking for us, it is also true. Part of the whole truth is we are subject to think what we have been taught to think. Just the fact that I'm using English says something about how my languaged thinking is profoundly influenced by wherever I learned English and all the values in that culture and all what it shows up in the media or whatever. It's hard to escape the forces of influence that are there as a human being, especially as a child, where we haven't found a way to use free will yet. I don't even think the part of the brain that allows us to use free will develops until puberty. So we learn stuff pretty much by conditioning, by rote, by repetition, by have a trial and error, and you do something, you get a reaction, you learn either not to do that again or you learn to do it again. So there are different theories. Bandura's theory of social cognition theory of conditioning is a powerful theory that looks at how it is that we learn by watching people model for us how to be. So as a young lad, I'm watching the men and older boys and the big boys, we used to call them, in my life and the ones that were on television. And I would watch them and I'd watch how they behave. Yes. And I would either just in my imagination, boy, I want to be like that. You know, I want to be a quarterback. I want to drive a car like my dad does. I want to drink like my dad does. I want to do things like my dad does. And Bandura's theory says that this is what we do. We observe, and then somewhere in our mind we say, I like that, or I want to try that, or something like that. And then we try it. And what we do is we play with it. And we play act, we role play, when you play house, we get to pretend we're daddy and we're mommy. How do I know how to be daddy? I am daddy like I've seen daddy be daddy. And I don't sit there thinking about how daddy was and then say, well, he was like this and he raised his hand this way and I want to raise my hand that way and I want to. It's not that thought out. It's a lot more automatic. And I think it's a big part of how we learn and a big part of how we learn values and how we learn the meaning of life and learn our identity. To identify you as a black man, I have all these ideas to go all the way back to when I grew up in Woburn. And God knows, many of them mistaken. And I've had to learn that many of them were mistaken. And I had many mistaken ideas about who I was too. But a lot of them were conditioned into us by experiences we've had. It's part of what is true about who we are as human beings. A lot of our thinking is still automatic. It's not lucid. You know the term lucid dreaming? Mm-hmm. You know, the idea that in the dream you can sort of become aware while you're dreaming that you're dreaming. And you go, I am dreaming now. And that changes everything in the drama, where you instead of being scared by the Tyrannosaurus Rex that's chasing you, you can turn and face, because now I can make choices. That idea that I can be lucid and mindful and aware of a situation and then use my will and my intention, that's the possibility of freeing myself from my conditioned thinking.
But there is a difference, I think, between learning through autonomous observation and learning as a consequence of responding to sanctions. Mm-hmm. St. Augustine, in his Confessions, for example, in one long but extraordinary paragraph, produces what took Chomsky and others years and years of verbiage to establish, namely that we learn how to speak by observing others who do the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do. Mm-hmm. And then there's a possibility that we can make choices about who we choose to listen to.
Correct.
And what crowd to hang around, so we can observe and listen to how they conduct themselves.
You're quite right, which takes me to have you comment on your interest in existentialism. Mm-hmm. Because the existentialists, at least Sartre, distinguish human beings in such a way that Sartre thinks that all human beings, without exception, have what he calls a factical dimension and a transcendental dimension. And I think critical theory, for example, would benefit tremendously from the usages of the facticity and transcendentality.
Yes.
That is an inherent attribute of our humanity than it does from behaviorism.
Yes.
If you can work that out for me, because your students speak quite highly of your course on existential psychology, in which they feel free to choose, a term that you just used about a second ago, which led me to get into this discourse on existential psychology. I hope it's appropriate.
Absolutely, it fits. It fits. We can't think clearly until we can somehow choose it, and then choose it again, and then choose it again, and then choose it again. So then that becomes automatic. Yeah,
and that's perhaps how we learn how to speak a language.
I think that is. There's whatever else is true, that our everyday lives are full of facts and objects, and our everyday living, with alarm clocks where I have to get up at 6 and I have to brush my teeth and I have to do this. The facts and the routines of our everyday living, which many are like valued and wonderful part of my life, and some I kind of just sleepwalk through in a way, like done it so often I'm not even thinking about it. So there's a facticity where we are acting out an already established idea of what this is and who I am and who you are and what I'm doing, and just kind of living my life comfortably or uncomfortably, but living my life in my everyday existence. And there's also the possibility of transcending the everyday, and that possibility exists along with a possibility to awaken our authentic sense of self, our authentic, I guess by authentic I mean where I take ownership for my life. I am the author of my life. in this moment, in this difficult time. It could be a difficult time where a police officer pulls me over. It could be a difficult time that I get a flat tire. Or in an ordinary time, just correcting papers, where I could be doing it automatically, and there's also a possibility that I can have a kind of waking up. It's like waking up from a slumber, and that's when the possibility that we can become more lucidly aware. Oh, here I am, and I'm doing this, and here I am getting anxious that I got pulled over by the police officer. And there's a possibility that when I become mindfully aware of that, and I take ownership for how I am feeling right now, don't blame no one else, don't even blame myself, just take ownership. I'm in command of this situation, not complete control, but I'm in command. I'll be able to handle this. That's the possibility of being the author of your own life, where you can exercise some thinking that breaks the mold of the ordinary thinking. It breaks the mold of the automatic thinking. The automatic thinking would get anxious and begin to call me names, what a silly, silly person I was. And there's a possibility of transcending that whole thing.
It's remarkable. So I'm sure that you encounter this both in the classrooms and also outside of the classrooms in your private clinical practices, namely this. Mm-hmm. There are some human beings who seem to have internalized certain kinds of beliefs mm-hmm. and have a difficult time overcoming them mm-hmm. when you encounter them both in the classroom setting and in your case, in the private sphere, to think about these belief systems. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that a blend of introducing them to their capacity for transcendental thinking, ground on their actual situation, their mm-hmm. actual context, namely the factical situation, the biological makeup, the psychological makeup, the moral makeup that they did not necessarily choose, right. but to which they became born. Right. Then you bring in a dosage of critical theory from the back mm-hmm. with their awareness to make them think mm-hmm. about their beliefs.
To make them become mindfully aware mm-hmm. of how they are talking to themselves, mm-hmm. that they are telling themselves stories. I feel more comfortable talking about this in the first person, because I too, that I make trouble for myself often by just telling myself a story about how troubling this is. When actually, when I can become more mindfully aware, which is sort of like just taking one step back and looking at it as if it was two characters in a movie or in a book. You realize it's like, well, it's not really that much of a problem. It's not. I'm developing a drama in my head. I think that the possibility of transcending the suffering in our life, and happens when we can become self-aware enough or mindful enough that we can see how we're actually creating the suffering in our life. I can't do anything about things I don't have choices about. I can't do anything about my age. I can't do anything about any number of things that I don't have choices about.
Those are the factical
That's the factical. The facts are the facts, and there it is. So that's the facts of a situation. What I can have most command over is how awake I am in the midst of this situation, what quality of mindfulness I have about, am I just being taken over by my reactions? Or can I see that, there I go again, I'm beginning to get taken over, and then just bring myself back. That my work as a clinical psychologist is to help clients learn how to do that.
I see.
And for myself as a therapist, I have to practice that as a therapist, because sometimes they say stuff which triggers things in me, thoughts, feelings, memories. And if I just let those thoughts, feelings, memories go, I will lose my attention, will wander, and I'll go off into my own thinking, which often happens to many people in any conversation.
Well, to your credit, this is a very delicate point. But there is this human being that both of us know. You must have worked on him.
I must have worked on him.
Because I'm beginning to see some positive changes in his comportment. How did you do that, Stephen?
Well,
he's a very stubborn individual.
So am I. I respectfully disagree. I don't think I worked on him. Mm-hmm. What I tried to do is, this is what I do. Can I talk about in terms of clients?
Of course.
What I do is I try to appeal to a client. Sartre's idea that we all have the facticity of our life. We're often absorbed in that. And Sartre's idea that there's a possibility for transcending that. His idea is all human beings have that possibility. Not all of us have lived a life where we've lived in the conditions where people have been encouraging us to do that. But we all have a possibility of that. So I actually use that as a guide, that principle to guide me. My job isn't to get them to transcend. My job is to, for some of them who have no idea it's even possible, to try to appeal to them in a way that they find appealing, to help them find their own interest in such a possibility.
Incredible.
See, we will only do what we're motivated to do. And most of us tend to be only motivated by stuff that we want or feel good. So I try to appeal to people where they would want to free themselves from a dangerous, destructive relationship. I mean, deeply want. There's one thing to say, yes, I want this, but the place where you don't want it, where you want to stay, if that keeps winning and you stay in the destructive relationship, we haven't really found the deep place where you deeply desire to transcend this. Mm-hmm. My job is to help each other, help him, and my job is to always learn from my client. So
of course.
I get to be better too.
Of course. You'll appreciate this very recently in the context of a classroom interaction. I came across a particular student whom I'm very fond of from one of these northern suburbs who told me after we developed a friendship that all that he has known up until the age of 18 and 19 are murky, demeaning descriptions of non-whites. I will have to be very careful. Mm-hmm. And then after a month of being in my class, interacting with me, and then developing a professional affection towards me, he began confiding in me segments of his history. Mm-hmm. And then when we began reading a chapter on existentialism, and I introduced him to these analytic distinctions between facticity and transcendentality. And then I looked at him straight in the eye and I told him, do you know that if you so wish, unlike those who taught you, that you can now say to yourself that I don't want to be a prejudiced human being. Yeah. He looked at me. Mm-hmm. He said, it's that simple? Mm-hmm. I told him, truth is simple. Mm-hmm. I told him, yes. What else can I do after that? Mm-hmm. I told him, practice.
That's it.
Develop new habits.
Have patience, because it's going to be, there will be inner resistance, and your family, because you're still in your family,
correct,
will not be happy either.
Precisely. I told him, but he told me, but my father might stop writing checks for me.
Right.
I told him, that is the consequence of choosing autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
That's the price that you have to pay.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have to negotiate the comfort zone of remaining in that state of mind that you are critically aware of, and the possibility of transcending it and inhabit a new horizon, a new perspective, a new life that is going to come with suffering.
Yeah.
The choice is yours, I told him. Satra only tells you that you can choose, and in that you're destined to choose.
You have no choice
You
but
have
to
no
choose.
choice but to choose.
Have no choice but to choose.
Did I mislead him a little bit? Or?
I don't think so. You were pointing to a possibility for him, and it sounds like it was a possibility he's interested in. You found where he finds it appealing, this possibility.
Yes.
And so to name the possibility for people who never even knew it was possible, and for them to begin to name that possibility for themselves is a powerful, powerful thing.
And that's what you do.
Contributes to our capacity. It contributes to our personal power, to our ability to free ourselves.
So, in
But
your
then
case,
comes the harder work
Yes.
of meeting each situation and needing to make choices again and again in each situation about, do I just do my usual ordinary, or do I take the step that is unfamiliar to me, take the step that's toward this new transcendent goal that I have for myself, but I'm less sure of it. I'm not so sure about this step, and it might hurt, it might cost me. Or do I just do what I usually do and fall into my usual habit? And that's what we have to do in each situation and moment. We're called upon again. Choose again.
Yes. And I couldn't help but think of you and how painful it must have been for you to watch the discourses during the government shutdown, when critical theory was conspicuously absent, in spite of the verbiage, the manipulation of language that the politicians were engaged in, speaking miles. Not even for a single moment did I sense critical thinking, transcending the situations in which these two parties were finding themselves in. By distancing themselves from what I and you would call the factical situation, and choosing an alternative for themselves and for the nation. It must have been quite painful for you to observe psychologically.
It was literally painful. It was, and just you bringing it up brings it up for me again. It is very hard for me to watch that now. It's very hard for me to watch that. It's in ancient Greek time, it was called sophistry, and it's just paid gunslingers who their weapon was words. They were paid to win debates, political debates, other kinds of debates. And we have paid gunslingers now, the advertisers who weave the storylines that they'll have us buy a box of cornflakes or whatever. And whoever else has the authority and the place of power to have their story put out there and just keep repeating the story over and over again, and without regard to whether the story is an accurate reflection of what's actually true. That there's just, no, the story benefits me. If we can get people to believe this, then it's beneficial. I've decided it's good for the United States, so I'm just going to get people to believe this, even though I know that I am, at times, lying or misleading and misdirecting. Even though I know at times I am not directly answering a question that's asked, because the question points to a hole a weakness in my reasoning, in my thinking, in my vision. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to poke holes. So instead I'm going to avoid addressing this question and just, go on with my own talking point.
Okay.
Drives me nuts.
Yes, and of course, I'm sorry that the technology that we have could not accommodate these slides that you wanted to bring. But perhaps we could talk about what some of these slides were going to show. What were you going to show us?
Well, I had a clip, and perhaps next time. I had a clip of a typical interview with a typical politician. Now, we used the word typical. Okay. That it's very likely you would see it even now, or next Sunday on Meet the Press, where the interviewer was from the network on a show like Meet the Press, interviewing, in this case, was Ron Paul. And how this took place, I'm sorry, I can't say accurately, I'm not sure. It was either before or just after the election. And I know, it wasn't that. It was actually about the recent crisis we went through, about whether or not the bill was going to be passed so that we could have our country back, so that things would be funded. And she was very pointed in asking him, would you be willing, are you going to say today, this is something a press does, are you going to say today, you're going to promise the nation today that you're going to speak to Speaker Boehner about how to just bring this bill up for a vote, because it will pass with the Republicans and with the Democrats. This is like the question, including, because it will pass with the Democrats and the Republicans, they will pass it. So it's very clear that the person who asked the question had an idea about what the right answer would be, and he didn't want to play her game by saying yes, and he wasn't going to do it anyway. So he didn't address her question. He literally did not give a yes or no, which is typical. You're not going to find too many politicians give a direct yes or no to anything. You won't hear many politicians go 3 sentences talking in any kind of detail at all about the initial question. And then they move on to their talking points. And you can tell they're either old, tired talking points or brand new talking points. And because you've heard it before, you've heard it from other people in the same party. What I find, and there's all kinds of official names for all kinds of the tactics used in rhetorical tactics, for the techniques used to avoid blowing up your own argument and to attack again or to blow up the opposing argument. That it's just what professional persuaders do. And politicians are nothing else but professional persuaders. My concept is politicians are always in the business of persuading people to vote for them. And then they maybe will do the work of government, like get bills passed. But mainly it's just speaking to whatever media that will hear them and saying the things that will convince their constituency that this particular politician is the one they should vote for again.
It's, for example, my professional philosophical judgment after witnessing this discourse among and between politicians during the government shutdown, that the American nation will be served better if an alternative is developed.
An alternative way of what? An alternative way of...
To these 2 dysfunctional parties.
I see. An alternative way to the political system.
Yes. I think the kinds of students that we teach in that particular age bracket, for the first time in their lives, are beginning to see the limitations of the market. And in that the market cannot be a substitute for functional ways of making people participate in the process of decision making.
Yeah.
What
I am
do
someone
you
who hasn't
think?
voted. I'm someone who hasn't voted, hadn't voted for decades after the McGovern
For
debacle.
good reason.
And I only took up voting again, say, in the last 10 years. It was during the Clinton administration, so it's longer than that now. And I'm finding myself having a real hard time voting again. I find it, you used a phrase something like to get people to engage in decision making, to get in the political process.
As critical thinkers.
Yeah. I think that media, news media in particular, has a possibility for doing this.
Yes.
You know, it's clear that news media, I'm talking about big time, either local news media or big time national news media, are in the business of making money. And so news has become the business of making money.
Correct.
So the show has to be entertaining, or it has to grab you or something. It has to keep an audience, and it has to keep going.
Yes.
Keep going.
Exactly.
So the way news seems to have evolved up to this point is where there's just room for sound bites, and there's just room for actually the politicians just speaking their talking points.
Absolutely.
Without any real in-depth looking into an issue.
Correct, as you were pointing in that
And I think,
clip that you were going to show us.
And I think that news media has, there's a real possibility here to, if anyone has the courage to do something like this, is to have their particular news broadcast, and maybe just one, be dedicated to something else.
What? This
Dedicated to taking a look at how politicians talk, and to educate, if you will, the people watching the show.
Correct.
So here's the technique they're using. Notice they're not really answering the question. Here's the fallacy. Here's this fallacy and that fallacy, and here's the straw man, and here they're doing. And so there are these different techniques, and to do it in a way that captures an audience's attention, and they learn, because we want to learn, and because we want to watch things that are interesting. And I think that there's a possibility that might be doable on that news show, where you're not really interviewing a politician yourself, but you're watching how they've been interviewed. And I'm talking about criticizing the media and the interviewer as well.
I think you have hit it right on its head. That is exactly where critical theory and critical thinking has to be fostered.
Yeah.
We have to develop critical thinking news media, which we do not have, because this media is committed to serve corporate interests. You have a local media, such as the one in which you are present, with a huge audience that is interested in critical thinking.
Yeah.
And I will bet you anything that the ones who are viewing Afghan Ascent are truly interested in listening to what you have to say, so that they can develop themselves, hone their suppressed skills of thinking critically, so that nothing like what happened on the floors of the Congress would happen in the name of the ruled.
Yeah, I think that it begins with us, and I'm speaking now as a citizen, us citizens taking ownership of our own life and look at what's been going on politically for quite a long time now, and realize that this isn't about blaming anyone else. this is what I've let happen.
Yes.
And as long as I continue to either be silent or continue to just let it keep happening, then I obviously am still voting to continue to let these debacles happen in government, that I'm not part of a solution.
We have about 2 minutes left, and the interview has hardly begun. But by now you have become a regular contributor to Afghan Ascent. So we're going to do part 2 of this discourse in the near future, when time permits. And in the meantime, I would like to give you the remaining of the show to instruct and to counsel my viewers about critical thinking and how they could develop it.
Sure.
1 minute left.
1 minute?
Yes.
Thanks. I think critical thinking is something that all of us can use in our everyday living, and that it's really about, all it's about is thinking clearly about a situation that I find myself in, thinking clearly about a problem, thinking clearly about a choice to be made, and to take the time and take the care to be considerate, to be deliberative, to make sure I'm dealing with facts and not just wishes or fears.
This has been your host, Teodros Kiros, for Afghan Ascent.